Hi, welcome to the third part of my comic making process. Today I am going to be working on comic strip number 10, and I'm going to be talking about coloring and the finishing and adding some finishing touches. Hi, my name is Escobar. I'm a storyboard artist from the Simpsons television show. I've been working on the show for over 25 years now, and I'm here to empower you. So, just as a really quick intro, this time around I found a video of a watercolor brush. I guess I'll link to it in the description. And I found it intriguing, especially because I've been wanting to make my comic look like watercolor. So I saw that there was these set of brushes for Clip Studio Paint that were watercolor, and Clip Studio Paint comes with watercolor brushes, but I never liked them. So this time, these brushes seem to look a little bit more like I kind of wanted them to. And one of the things of one of these brushes, what they do, and maybe I'll actually link to the brushes where I found them, so that you guys can take a look at them and download them yourself if you have Clip Studio Paint and you want them. One of the things about these brushes is that they have Clip Studio Paint has two colors. You know how in Photoshop too, you have like the primary and the secondary color, and you kind of flip back and forth between them. And they're two little boxes that you can see which color you're picking, and if you press X, you can flip between them. Well, the watercolor brush, what it does is it takes the top, the main color that you've selected, and then uses the second color as a secondary color so that it kind of mixes them together depending on how hard the pressure on the pen is. So if you press, for example, if you have say a white, and you have a gray on the bottom or a black, so you're painting white, and then you press harder, and the harder you press, the more black you're getting, and then as you let go, it mixes with the white, and so you're able to manipulate that and with in a watercolory texture. And I found that to be I like the results that gave me, and the reason why that is more intuitive and more kind of the results that I want is because when I actually paint in watercolor, I do it in a lot of layers. Like I do a first pass and the second pass and the third pass, and the passes aren't always like an intuitive color that you would think would go with what I want. So for example, in general, I tend to use like a burnt umber, kind of a red umber, a burnt umber kind of value. When as you saw in the last video, my shading is all kind of that burnt umber, red umber kind of value, and I use that as my main shadows. But the thing is, when it comes, and I tend to do that a lot with the skin, right? But when it comes to other things that aren't necessarily skin, I actually like using like an ultramarine or French blue, which is like a really dark blue. And the thing about these two colors, the burnt umber and the ultramarine blue, when you mix them together, they make black. They make good shadows, and depending on whether or not you're using more burnt umber or more ultramarine, you get cool and warmer shadows. So what I did in this, and you will see this, is that I would take the color that I was going to paint as my primary, some kind of skin color, some kind of green, some kind of blue, whatever it is that I was going to paint, the local color, and then I would put the shadow color, like the ultramarine blue type color, or when it came to the skin, in this case, I actually put crimson because I wanted it to go way more towards red, because I already had the the umber underneath. I did the shadows already, so the shadow layer was already there. The brown umber, the burnt umber valley was already there. So then when I put, I would get a crimson red, and I would do that, and then I would, and what I would get was a really bright crimson red tint to the skin, or I would get a very dark blue value to the shadows, and then it went into the regular local color, and this mix felt really watercolory. It felt like they were blending together in a very water tends to be very granular. You could see the grains together kind of combining and pushing on each other. And the thing about these brushes, the way that they were mixing, is that you got that kind of granular look. It felt like there was that competing colors trying to fight. And that is a very interesting, beautiful look in watercolor. And I really like that effect. And I like the way that it looks. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. The other thing that happened, though, and you were going to absolutely see this in the video, is that I had no idea how to use the brushes at first. Like, no idea. Like, to the point where I actually started the process the same way that I started all the other coloring processes. If you look at all the other videos of me coloring, what I do is I would get the darkest value of the local color that I was going to use, and then I would put that down first, and then I would come in with an airbrush, and I would just really quickly just kind of lighten it all up really fast, right? And the way that it looked like a little bit of watercolors, because I had a watercolor texture on top of the picture, but otherwise it was just airbrush. It was just really quickly just airbrushing light so that there was a gradient in all the local areas. So I started doing it like that. That's kind of the approach I started doing it, but the brushes didn't want to work that way. That's not the way these brushes work, and it was just like a big mess. And for the first maybe 2 hours, or first hour or hour and a half, I don't remember, it was a struggle. I didn't know what I was doing. I started over. I worked for a good hour or so trying to color something, and then I ended up having to scrap it all away. I had to just throw away those layers because it was such an ugly, uncontrolled mess. It just didn't work. And so I got the bright idea of using these watercolor simulation brushes as if they were, gasp, watercolors. What do I do when I use watercolors? I start with the lightest light, not the mid-tone, not the darkest dark. I start with the lightest pass I can, and then I go and then add darker and darker. And that's the way that you use these brushes. You start with a light, and then you start darkening it up as you go. But here's the thing. I didn't start with the watercolors first. What I ended up, the watercolor brushes first, what I ended up doing was basically the exact same thing that I do with all the other coloring that you've seen me do, which is I just grab a section and then I just put in the local color. This time, however, the local color had to be the lightest version of the color I was going to use for that area. So usually it's the darkest. This time it was the lightest, and I used a regular marker, like a monofill pen, and that's what I used. It was just very, very quickly just put all the colors in, so it wasn't the watercolor version at all. And then afterwards I created a brand new layer where I did all the watercolor brush stuff on, and that's the one that, and that's how it worked. It worked better when it was regular first flat values in the first layer, and then you do the watercolor on the second layer, and then after that I would put highlights and bounce light and all that other fancy types of finishing touches. But believe me that by the time I was done, maybe my second day of trying to get these colors right, the coloring right, and failing miserably, I was ready to quit. I was ready to just like forget these brushes. I don't know how to make them work. I started getting desperate. I was like, no, I can't believe this is not working. I can't. And then afterwards, I just kept at it. And then little by little, I'm like, okay, I'm trying to, oh, it's working. Oh, okay. So yeah, so it was a little bit frustrating at first. All right, so without further ado, let me show you the craziness that was working on this, coloring this comic strip. All right, so this actually is a sped up version of about 10 hours worth of work. So here I am doing the dark pass that I was talking about in the introduction, where everything was the dark version, and then I was going to go into and do the light pass on that, and it just wasn't working. So I ended up just kind of tossing it all out after a while, and started doing this light version instead. So here I'm doing the flat color. It's just the monofill pen, and now here it is. This is where I'm starting to use the watercolor brush, and as you can see, if you pay very close attention to the actual color selections that I'm using, you can see the crimson and along with the more darker skin value that I'm using, and all the values that I'm using, I'm color picking from my already color value chart. And here I am putting texture, watercolor texture on top of the drawing, so and working on layers. So if you saw these, like those little flashes of light and dark and all these changes, it's because I was checking the adjustment layers. What best adjustment layer can I put the shadows in so that I could get the best results? What I ended up going with, by the way, if you're curious, I took the shadow layer that is the umber layer, and I turned it into an overlay layer, and that seemed to work, right? That seemed to work. See, I'm putting the flats here, so it's just really straightforward. I'm not using a watercolor pen. I'm using a monofill pen, and I'm just putting in the flats. Then I grab the shadow layer, the brown umber, and I put it on an overlay adjustment layer, and then I go in and I start putting in the watercolor. This doesn't quite look right. I think at this point, this is where I had it on multiply instead of overlay, and then I put it on overlay, because I got richer colors as a result. So moving forward, so like the first panel, the first drawing of Isabella, I ended up using multiply as on the shadows as my adjustment layer. But as I went, especially by the time I finished this second panel, I had switched to making it an overlay. And this again, like the whole time that I'm doing this is just a trial and error experimentation, what's working, what's not working. But I was getting more and more excited about the way that all these things looked in the end. So and here I am making adjustments for like textures and different things like that. And the background also I needed to make sure that the background wasn't too in the way, but it needed to be not so gray either. So I ended up I think by the time I get past finished with this panel here, the background in panel 2 was way too saturated. And so what I ended up doing by the time I finished this background here was I made the background far less saturated, much grayer, so that it wouldn't compete with the rich colors of the main characters, because the main characters, I wanted them to be very pretty. The colors like really stand out, and I wanted the background to just be background. I just wanted it to just kind of be atmosphere and not really something that stood out anymore. I mean, the background, I already showed that it was a fancy background. There's no reason to just keep going with that kind of look at me, look at this background, isn't it crazy? Even though I did spend months constructing the background in 3D, I didn't want, I don't want the background to be anything other than just just a feeling, right? And see, so you could see that the values in the background are now much grayer than they were in the in panel 2. So I had to go back in panel 2 and reduce the colors on panel 2. One of the things that I ended up doing near the end of this, and you're going to see this, is I realized, but I had finished. I had already. I started. I had finished the drawing. I had finished doing all the finishing touches, putting the highlights and the bounce lights and all that stuff. And I was exporting the final version. I was making JPEGs and everything, and then suddenly I realized, oh my gosh, the blonde character Ken, that character was the first character that is introduced in the comic, and he was wearing a fedora, and I totally forgot to put the fedora on his head. So I ended up having to come back and fixing that. And here I am putting the ground texture for the background, because now you actually get to see it. And so the background needed more work, because now you saw the background more. Before, the characters were covering it and they had that haze over it, so that I didn't have to do as much work. But this time, because the background stood out so much, I actually had to go in and really touch up the background, make it look like something. And then after all of that, I blurred it anyway. I blurred it, and then I just kind of erased the blur around the character in the background. That way it's still, it just focused on him, or on her in this case. And so Ken back there. See, so now here I am putting in the fedora, and the first version of the fedora, I even went as far as coloring it, only to realize that I drew the fedora wrong. I didn't like the way that it looked, so I ended up having to scrap this version, and then I erased it, and I fixed it. There you go, like that. That's what it needed to look like, and that's basically it. That's the entire process from beginning to end of the coloring process. Hopefully that was informative. Thank you so much for watching. Yeah, and that's it from me, and I will talk to you next time. All right, bye.